So my topic, as Carmeline has kindly said, is a problem-solving approach to teaching and learning English. And really, I'm talking here at a very general level. I'm trying to kind of think about the whole English language teaching process at a kind of macro level. And when okay, why is it not moving? My screen does not seem to be moving. Okay, that's great. Okay, so what I'd like to say is, in very general terms, that when you're thinking about English language education, you need to do kind of three things. So first of all, you need to identify a problem that you're trying to solve, then think about ways of addressing that problem, and then you try out some possible solutions. And in terms of language teaching, that really maps onto three kind of things. So first of all, you think about what is it in terms of language that we want the learners to do better. And then the second question is, how do we think they're going to learn to do that? And then thirdly, we try out some ways of teaching which we hope will lead to improvement. Now, when we think about the first question, so what is the problem? Essentially, what we're saying is that learners are not able to use the language as well as either the learners or the teachers want. And that's a kind of key point. Now, it's really, really central that you start with the learners. It's very kind of tempting to think about other kind of things, you know, what's in the curriculum, what's in the textbook, but the starting point needs to be the learners, right? And then the curriculum will come in later. But basically, when we're looking at what the learners want to be able to do better, we need to think in terms of their target. Where do we want them to be? And their target may be in terms of an exam, or it may be in terms of some more general communicative ability. But the other thing we need to think about is what knowledge do they already have? And if you like, what we're trying to do is how we get from number 2, where the learners are now, to number 1, which is where we want them to be at the end of the teaching. Now, the first question is a linguistic question. What do we want the learners to do better? Okay, and at this stage, I would like you all to think about a group of learners. Okay, and think about, well, what is it that you want them to do better? And you can think about it in whatever terms you want. And then in a moment, I'll look at some of the ways people have conceptualized this kind of diagnosis of what learners need to do. So just think about that for maybe 10 seconds. What is it you would want your learners to do better? Okay. Right, and I will come back to this question later on, okay? But this is, I think, is always the starting point for where a teacher should begin. Now, when we look at how we describe language, there are lots of different models out there, and this is one of the kind of confusions that we have in TESOL and English language teaching. I'm going to talk very briefly about 3 of the main frameworks that people use, and the one which gets the most kind of attention in the academic literature is what I would describe as communicative competence. So this was a reaction to Chomsky's idea about linguistic competence, but communicative competence, which Canale and Swain and Himes developed in lots of ways. So probably the most recent version of this model is Bachman's model of communicative competence. And he really divides this up into 2 parts. So there's organizational competence, which is to do things like grammar, but also to do with the structure of texts. And what he describes as pragmatic competence, which is more procedural, if you like. So how do you use language to achieve a particular purpose? And how do you use language in order to maintain appropriate relations with other people? Now, this kind of framework has been quite widely talked about. But one of the things which is quite striking about this framework is if you look at textbooks, if you look at syllabuses, they don't tend to use this very much. And I think it is worth thinking about why that is. But this doesn't seem to kind of translate into teaching and learning in a very easy sort of way. A second kind of model is what I would describe as an elements or levels approach. And essentially this sees languages comprising different levels. So at the top level, we have text, which is to do with semantics and meaning. Then moving down, we have words. And here you will see I'm using the term lexicogrammar. So from the linguistic tradition I come from, a Hallidayan tradition, lexis and grammar are not treated as separate bits, but many of you will come from traditions which see lexis and grammar as separate. So vocabulary is separate and grammar is separate, but these would still count as the same level, because if you like, grammar is how words are put together. And so lexis and grammar are kind of fairly closely connected. Now, at this stage, you will see in the third column on my slide, I've described this as form. Okay, so form is one of these slightly tricky words you get now in linguistics. This form is used with different ways, but here I'm using form to talk about the vocabulary and the grammar of the language. At the bottom of the slide, you can see there are two levels, both of which are labeled sounds and letters. And so here you have what in linguistic terms is phonology, and in kind of everyday speech is sounds and letters. But if you like, linguists here would make a big distinction between phonology, which is the perceived language, how language is heard, how language is understood, and phonetics, which is the kind of physical bits of the language. When we talk about phonetics, we're really talking about a branch of physics, whereas where we talk about phonology, we're talking about a branch of linguistics. And here I'd want to make the expression, again, this is terms borrowed from Halliday, substance is the phonology and expression is the phonetics. Those are the kind of four divisions. And you will see that this model has actually been quite influential in language teaching. But one of the ways I kind of want to gloss this a little bit is how we talk about texts. I think one of the things which has happened in the last, I suppose, 20 years now in English language teaching is there's been a slight move in terms of the focus on grammar and vocabulary towards a focus on texts. And here I'd want to say there are two kind of frameworks in which people talk about texts, but these actually are kind of are related. They are complementary, I think. So the first thing is the one which is most dominant in kind of linguistics, which is the notion, most dominant in English language teaching, which is tasks. And this really comes from Prabhu's work in Bangalore. So this was, if you like, the really big dramatic change in English language teaching, which did start in India. So I think this is something where we can look at how India has influenced language teaching. But the notion of the task, which is so rather than focusing on grammar, rather than focusing on vocabulary, you focus on what people do with language. So it's a functional view of language. And here I've given you the Gonzalez, Loretta, and Ortega definition. So primary focus on language, a goal orientation, that means it's functional, it's centered on what the learners are doing, it's holistic, it's not trying to analyze it into grammar or vocabulary, it's looking at the whole of the task. And there's some kind of reflection. So the learning happens partly through metacognition. But the other kind of model you get coming out of the text view of language is the genre model. And I would actually, I would argue that this is really another view of the task. But here, the genre, this is a definition taken from Martin working in Australia, a staged goal-oriented process. And social events, texts are always interactive events. So it's not just a written text, you have a reader and a writer, or if it's spoken text, a speaker and a listener. It's goal-oriented, which you will notice is the same as what we said for tasks, and it's staged, so it has a kind of structure within it. So those are kind of two models of text which have become quite more kind of highlighted in language teaching. And if we go back to the kind of stages we talked about before. Now here you can see I put it the other way around because this is the way language textbooks quite often talk about it. So instead of talking about phonetics and phonology, people now quite often talk about pronunciation. There's also a little bit of work done on spelling, though spelling is something which I think is is not covered sufficiently in language teaching. We tend to get an awful lot of work done on grammar. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about how this fits into the models we've been talking about. And again, one of the big kind of trends in recent years has been a bigger focus on vocabulary because people have felt that that's something where students lack. And then instead of talking about text, people quite often talk about discourse. So we have these four levels. And if you look at your textbooks, if you look at your syllabuses, you're quite likely to see some things using this framework. Now, the other kind of big framework, and again, this is one which has been very strongly influential in language teaching, is in terms of skills. So we have skills which we can talk about in terms of orality, in terms of speaking, or in terms of literacy, in terms of writing. And they can be either receptive or they can be productive. And so this gives us four bands, so four squares. We've got listening, reading, speaking, writing. And again, this is a very influential model. People use this a lot in language teaching. So we've looked at three kinds of models, okay? And here I'd like you to reflect back on what I asked you to do at the beginning, to think about what you want your learners to do better. So when you were doing that, when you were asking that question, was your answer in terms of things like communicative competence? Was it in terms of things like levels, in terms of discourse, in terms of grammar, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of pronunciation? Was it in terms of skills, in terms of reading or writing? Now, the point I'm making here is that when you ask teachers to do this, you will actually get quite a big range of answers. But one of the things that is quite striking is they tend to use one framework rather than a combination. And so this illustrates that teachers are using these theories. So even though teachers may say they don't have a theory, they always do have a theory, but they may not be aware of what that theory is. And one of the reasons for looking at these different models is that sometimes one model is better at describing what our learners need to do. So that's kind of looking at the first question: what is it we want our learners to do better? So now, the other side of that is, what do they bring to the classroom already? And my feeling is that this is the area which is going to get most attention in the next few years. So for a long time, we've kind of treated learners as though they come to the classroom with nothing. And one of the reasons for this is that English language teaching has traditionally been very monolingual. So when people are teaching English language, they've tried to say, well, we need to just use English. And one of the kind of ways in which this is problematic is actually most learners bring a lot of their other languages to the classroom. And just before this talk, I was talking to some of your colleagues, to Tara and Natul, about the fact that one of the kind of really kind of interesting things about India is a very multilingual country, that people have lots of different languages. And what we need to think a little bit more about, I think, is how we can use those languages to help people learn English. And I do think the notion of translanguaging is something which is going to be worth exploring. But here I'm not saying the other languages are always an advantage. So if you look at the question, what do they bring to the classroom which might support, but also what might hinder? So the other languages that learners bring to the classroom is both a good thing and a bad thing. And one of the things teachers need to work out is how they can make best use of the resource that the learners bring to the classroom. And this is quite an interesting thing. So one of the areas where you can see a lot of work going on in this is if you look at the difference between people who start learning English in primary school and people who start learning English in secondary or high school, is in high school, people already know how to read well. So they bring the skills in reading in other languages to English, which is different from what happens in primary school. So teaching reading in primary school, teaching reading in English in primary school is a much bigger task than it would be in a high school. Now, this is a kind of summary of what we talked about: communicative competence, language levels, language skills, but also this fourth point I've made here, other resources. Very important to think about what learners bring to the classroom that we can use as language teachers in their learning. Now, the second question I want to move on to is about theories of learning. And again, if you read the literature, you will see that this is a very big part of the literature. There are whole kind of sections of libraries on which cover different theories of learning. What I want to look at today is broadly look at three kind of important, what I would say are the most important or most common models of learning in language teaching. And then I'm just going to flag up motivation. I'm not going to talk about motivation in any detail, but motivation is obviously quite a key concept, and I think all language teachers know that. So I'm going to look at the mentalist, or the model associated with Krashen, the cognitive, the adaptive control of thought, or skill-based learning, which is really was originated by Anderson, but has been taken up by a wide range of people. And then thirdly, the socio-cultural Vygotskian model. And it's interesting to see where all these things come from. And if you like, as I said, I'm not going to talk very much about motivation, but motivation, I think, is one area which we need to do quite a lot of work on. So in the monitor model, which is Krashen's model, this is kind of borrowed from Chomsky. This is a model which says learning a second language is broadly speaking the same as learning your mother tongue, learning the first language. And the big kind of idea here is to do with acquisition rather than learning. So Krashen makes a very strong division between acquisition, which is where you pick up a language, where you're exposed to the language and you just start using it without kind of formal instruction. So this is this doesn't see a very big role for the teacher. So for Krashen, what the teacher does is to do with learning. That's have formal instruction in grammar, vocabulary, or text, or pronunciation. But for Krashen, acquisition and learning are completely separate. Then they don't make any contact. And for Krashen, what teachers should be doing is focusing just on acquisition. So people should be exposing learners to lots and lots of language. And again, one of the things that's happened with the internet, and now since the pandemic, is people have been using online resources a lot more. So that's kind of quite a big thing there. Now, the other side of that bit is the monitor. So the monitor is where we use the learning part of our brain to look at the acquisition part of our brain. And for Krashen, this really only happens where you have lots of time and where you're focusing on accuracy. And so for Krashen, this is mainly in exams. So the monitor, even though that's the name of the theory, the monitor is not actually very important. The other points, the three other points that Krashen make are, first of all, the idea about the natural order, which is that when we learn a language, we learn it in a fixed order. Now, the fixed order for Krashen, he comes from a Chomskyan background where the focus is very much on grammar. So he sees this basically in terms of morphology, in terms of word parts. So for Krashen, we have to learn things in a particular order. And you will notice here that this is a universal thing. So this doesn't take into account anything about learner variation. And I think if you're a language teacher, you'll know that that's sometimes a problematic idea to start with. But the next point that Krashen made is really kind of central. And I think this is one that most language teachers would agree with, which is that you need to have comprehensible input, that learners need to be exposed to things they understand. And this is something really where I think teachers have an enormous role to play, that when we're teaching, quite often we're teaching with books which are not that appropriate for our learners. So we have to think, how can we make this text appropriate? How can we make it comprehensible for our learners? And that brings us on to the final point, which is sort of related to motivation, which is that Krashen says that when people are anxious, when people are nervous, they don't acquire language. And notice here I'm using the word acquire rather than learn. So Krashen would say that when we are learning, when we are studying a language, when we're trying to acquire it, we need to do that in a non-stressful kind of context. And again, that obviously has big implications for how we organize classrooms and things like exams. Now, the second model I want to talk about is what I describe as a cognitive model. And my sense is at the moment, this is the dominant model in language teaching. You will see there are some parallels with the kind of things Krashen talks about. In this model, we basically have a three-stage, or at least a two-stage model of learning. So to begin with, well, not necessarily to begin with, but one of the earlier stages can be declarative knowledge. So this is basically where learners get knowledge about language. So for example, things like grammar rules, the meaning of words, the structure of texts, how to make particular sounds, that would all count as declarative knowledge. But this is not to do with actually using the language, it's to do with understanding it or knowing it. Then the next stage is what Anderson describes as procedural, okay, or the associative stage. And this is where people are using the language. Okay, so there's a really big division between declarative knowledge, which is knowing the language, and procedural knowledge, which is using the language, being able to use it. Okay, and within procedural knowledge, Anderson and Sabeltrike and Johnson make a big division between controlled and automatic. So the idea is that when we are starting to use a language, you have to do it in a fairly conscious way. You have to stop and think about it. And then gradually, as you use it more, you become more expert. So here, this is quite an important kind of point, because here you will see here, this is one of the big differences from Krashen's idea. Here, the idea is that practice is important. Okay, so for Krashen, you just listen to the language and you automatically start to use it. For Sabeltrike and Anderson and Johnson, you use the language, you understand it, and then you practice it. So here, this is much more in line with what happens in quite a lot of classrooms. And one of the things you might want to reflect on is whether your own classrooms are more influenced by Krashen or more influenced by Anderson. Now, one of the points, though, I would want to make here within the cognitive model is to do with the notion of deliberate practice. Because again, if you are a teacher, you will know that sometimes you do a lot of practice in the classroom and the practice doesn't seem to have a very positive effect. And so one of the ideas that people are now working on is something called deliberate practice. Okay, so this is moving a little bit beyond just repeating things, all right? But it is very, very focused. So instead of just saying, oh, try doing this again, okay, you say, well, I want you to focus particularly, for example, on the pronunciation of this sound, or on this bit of grammar, on this bit of text structure, all right? But then the teacher needs to give detailed feedback on what happens. And then the learner needs to think about that. There needs to be this metacognition going on as well. So deliberate practice is quite an important idea, a little bit under-researched, I would say, but something I think teachers can look at in their own classrooms. Now, the third model I want to look at is Vygotsky. As I said, I think the cognitive models are the dominant ones, but in many ways, Vygotsky is the one which is easiest to apply to the classroom. All right. And Vygotsky's main point is that learning starts off as social and then becomes psychological. And again, if you like, this reflects the classroom. So the classroom is a social environment in which language learning happens, but then you hope that when people leave the classroom, they have that psychological knowledge in their heads. So this kind of fits in fairly closely with that. The second reason why I think Vygotsky's ideas are quite important is he talks about scaffolding or support. Okay, and I should say Vygotsky himself doesn't talk about scaffolding, he just talks about support. But here you can see that Vygotsky did actually think about the role of the teacher. So here the teacher is providing support to learners to help them to do something better. Now, the notion of scaffolding is quite important, okay, but one of the points that people often forget is that scaffolding is meant to be temporary. So that while they're in the classroom, they're being supported by the learners, by the teachers, I should say, but then gradually the teacher will withdraw that support. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to move to getting the learners to be more independent. Now, this is one place where you may see a parallel between Vygotsky and Anderson. Okay, so if you like, for Anderson, the notion of practice helps you to go from controlled to automatic, where the automatic is where you're independent. For Vygotsky, what happens is when you're practicing with support, then gradually that support is withdrawn, and then the learners are able to do things independently. The third point that you'll see people talk a lot about for Vygotsky is what he calls the zone of proximal development. Now, this is actually a kind of fairly sensible idea, but it's basically the idea is that when you have a learner working on their own, they can only do so much. If they're working with help, they can do more. And the difference between what they can do on their own and what they can do with help is the zone of proximal development. And for Vygotsky, that's where the learning needs to happen. And you think that this is kind of logically built into his system. But you can see with Vygotsky, you move from what the learners can do on their own to what they can do with support. And then you get the scaffolding, and then gradually the scaffolding is withdrawn, and then they're able to do more things on their own. So learning is happening in that sort of way. Now, at this stage, I'd like you to think back to your own experience and hear, not as a teacher, but as a learner. Is there something you have learned to do recently that you've learned to do? So for example, is there something to do with using computers? Have you started using Zoom in a different way? Have you got some new ideas? How did that learning happen? And how does that learning relate to the kind of models we've been talking about? Does it seem more like a Krashen view where you just get lots of input? Is it more like a Anderson thing where you get kind of explicit knowledge and then you apply it? Or is it a more Vygotskian thing where it's basically you're working with other people and you're getting help from other people? And I should say for Vygotsky, not just other people, but other things. So all these models, I think we need to think about in quite a lot of detail. All right, now the third question I want to talk about, with an interesting typo on the slide, is teaching methods. Okay, and again, if you look at the literature, there are many different models of teaching methods. Here I'm just going to talk very briefly about grammar translation, audiolingual, weak CLT, strong CLT, and CLIL and EMI. All right, and at this stage, I would ask you to think about which methods you have used in your classroom, but also think about which methods you find most successful. And one of the things which is quite striking when you talk to teachers is actually teachers tend not to use just one method. They tend to use combinations of things, and they use different models at different times. So this is something which I think is very important to think about. Okay, but the thing I want to stress here is that you can only think about how you're going to teach those learners after you have decided what it is you want them to do better and how you think they're going to learn. Okay, it's very dangerous to say, oh, I want to be a CLT teacher, or I want to be a task-based teaching teacher, without thinking about the learners first. The learners have to be the people you consider first. Now, the point that I now want to come back to is the overall kind of framework, so that when we talk about language learning, we think about it in terms of these three things. What do we want the learners to do better? How might they learn to do that? How might they learn to do this better? And how can my teaching support? Now, if you think back to these methods here, so you can see here the kind of support that these methods suggest are very different. So grammar translation makes quite a lot of use of other languages, right? And you have to think, well, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? If you look at the audiolingual method, that's completely the opposite. No use of the mother tongue, no use of other languages, you just use English, right? But the audiolingual approach has lots and lots of practice, lots of repetition. And again, you need to think, is that a good thing? In weak CLT, what you're trying to do here is you're starting off with the model, which is a little bit like audiolingualism to begin with, but the end result, you hope, is a communicative activity. And the main critique people have of weak CLT is the actual communicative activity doesn't always happen, right? But if you want to think of it in terms of your own teaching, what happens in your classroom? So the strong CLT or task-based teaching approach starts with communication. So here we are, let's communicate, and then we analyze what goes wrong, and then we try and teach to that. Okay. Now, the really big advantage of strong CLT or task-based teaching is that the syllabus, if you like, comes out of the tasks, comes out of what the learners are not able to do. Whereas if you look at things like grammar translation, audiolingual, and sometimes weak CLT, the main critique of those is that the syllabus is designed, is pre-written for those learners. Okay. Whereas strong CLT, task-based teaching, you start off by saying, well, can you do this? If they can do it, you don't need to teach it. If they can't do it, you need to go on to do something else. And the fourth kind of strand, the fifth strand I'd like to talk about here is EMI, CBT, and CLIL. So these are all versions where we're not really teaching the language, we're teaching a subject through the language. And again, this has actually been quite common in India for a long time, even though maybe not described in these ways. But essentially here, what we're having is that the learners are doing things through English. They're studying technology, they're studying physics, they're studying history through English, and that's how the English is being improved. But in many contexts, particularly in high schools or secondary schools where this happens, you also have CLIL, CBT, or what CLIL would be the normal term in high schools, is combined with some kind of weak CLT or audiolingualism in separate classes. So you quite often get two things going on in parallel. And again, those might be things which it's worth thinking about. So when you think about these, which of the methods do you find most useful, and how do you see some sort of sense that for particular learners or particular learning objects, certain things work better than others? And that really brings us to, to what I want to kind of come up with the end, is when we think about language teaching, what do my learners need to do better? How can I help them to do that better? So how are they going to learn to do that? And how can I help them do that better? And that's really all I want to say. So it's been a very general talk, but I hope it's been useful. Okay, and now if there are any questions, I'm happy to use that. Okay, so Kamaleen, do you want to take over a bit now? Thanks.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. This is one of the most productive sessions of the ELT Summit 2022. Sir has actually taken us through the ELT classrooms, helping us understand core concepts like form, function, and discourse. Then gave us a simple but complete overview of the three models which are prominent in the field. I am sure we all are ready to develop deep into this field. Thank you so much, sir. We will surely identify the problems and work towards finding solutions to them in our classrooms. Now, we will take a few questions. We have a question from Professor Rajabha Patil. He says, could you please give us simple steps of conducting need analysis in English classes to detect a problem and solve it?
Okay, thanks. That's a really good question. Okay, and one of the things which I think I would say is the strengths of task-based teaching is that kind of needs analysis is built into the classroom, right? So within a task-based teaching approach, the starting point is what tasks do the learners need to be able to do, right? And so that may be something very simple like booking a hotel room, but it might be something more complicated like writing an academic essay. Right. So essentially, the approach would say when you start, you actually try and get the learners to do those things. Right. And if they can do things, that's great. And you can move on to the next topic on your syllabus. But if they're not able to do that, then you say, well, in what ways can I help them to do that? And so that's the kind of overall model. Now, I appreciate that sometimes seems like an oversimplification. Now, if you're working with something like booking a hotel room, that's quite easy to do. Whereas if you're working with a kind of more complex task like writing an academic essay, you are probably going to need to break it down into subcomponents. So you probably wouldn't, if you're teaching a group of learners who want to write essays in English, if you're worried that this is a long way above their capacity, you're probably going to start off with, well, what are the sub skills involved in that? And let's try and do a task on one of those sub skills. So that's the approach I would say. And I do think that's one of the strengths of task-based teaching. But I mean, it may come up later in discussion, but there are also some problems with it. But the needs analysis thing is built into the teaching model.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from Durga. She says, when we design a task, shall we need to design through a theory and method identified always?
Okay, yeah. So one of the problems I have with Lockett academic discourse is it makes a very strong division between theory and practice, right? And but I think my own view is that everybody has a theory, but they may not know what that theory is, right? And one of the reasons for looking at theories is so that you can see how other people think about these things. But in the end, the important thing is how you think about these things. So the question, I don't think we have an option of not doing it through a theory, because we always have to think about it. So when I was talking about language, I said, if you ask teachers to talk about what their learners need to do better, the way they will talk about it shows they have a theory, but they may not be aware of that theory, right? So if I was giving advice to teachers, I'd say, well, you don't need the theory, but you will have a theory anyway. All right. So I don't think you actually say, well, I need to have a theory, okay? But you do need to have good reasons for doing what you do. And as soon as you move from a position as a teacher from saying, well, this is what happens in one context, to saying this is what happens more generally, you are moving to a more theoretical perspective. So I think I wouldn't encourage people to say, oh, you have to have lots of theories, but I would say that everyone does actually have a theory. And you need to think about your theories, and you need to kind of make sure that they fit reality. So, you know, there's nothing. So one of the kind of little phrases academics like is there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And again, that sounds like a kind of an argument for saying we need to have lots of theories. It's not really. It's saying you need to have lots of practice, or practice in you need to do things, and then think about why you are doing those things. And that why is your theory.
Our next question is from Shomita. She asks, content-based lesson plan is stressed by NEP. How far this is useful in language acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, and this is a very difficult question, and we don't really have an answer at the moment, I think. Okay, but so the two things that I want to say, so I've looked at, in terms of terminology, my experience is people talk about CLIL when it happens in high school, and they talk about EMI when it happens in universities. Okay, but one of the things which is quite striking is at the moment when CLIL happens in secondary schools, and again, my experience here is in the UK, and it's not with English, it's where people are learning German or French or Spanish, but you're learning another subject. But what happens typically in a UK school would be that you would have a CLIL class, say in history, which would be taught through Spanish, but you would also have a Spanish lesson. So there would be a parallel between the CLIL lesson and the language lesson. Okay, if you look at what happens in universities, again, my experience is mainly in the UK, but I have looked at some universities in France and some in China, and there the model actually seems to be rather different. The model seems you just have the class which is taught through English. So people do, so in France, people were doing business through English. In China, people were doing physics through English. Now, if you actually look at what happens here, is that this actually creates quite a lot of stress for the teacher. And one of the interesting things in China was that in the classes I looked at, the physics classes were taught partly by people whose mother tongue was English and who had limited Chinese, and partly by people whose mother tongue was Chinese and were expert speakers of English. And there was quite a big difference between the classes which were taught by the native speakers of English and the native speakers of Chinese. And the native speakers of Chinese were using a reasonable amount of Chinese in the classroom. Okay, and I think I would be really interested to see how this happens in India. Because again, as I say, so India is a much more complicated country in terms of languages than China. So what would happen? So do people use other languages, and do people use more than one other language? But I think unless you provide support, language support outside the EMI class, it's quite difficult to do EMI effectively, just because the language support isn't there. But I would be really interested to hear what people's experiences are of this, because my understanding is EMI and CLIL are quite common in India, and I think probably started here before other places. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So we take one last question from Anne. She asks, how about using the social learning skills that the learners bring with them? She says pure learning to give support and feedback can be very powerful.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I would really encourage this. Okay, so that when I think one of the kind of negative things of some of the older models of language teaching and things like audiolingualism is they treated the learners as a zero, as having no knowledge at all. Right, and I think that the kind of social skills learners bring to the classroom are very, very important. And I'm cheating a little bit here, but one of the really interesting classes which I've seen, again, this was in France, but the English language teacher who was a native speaker of French, but she was actually encouraging her learners to use Twitter as a social medium, as a way of helping with their English, because she said Twitter was really useful for them because it was fairly short text in English, which they could understand, but because it was real communication, they found it very, very motivating. So that was a particular kind of social skill that the teacher was using. So I think if you're able to do that within an Indian context, I think that would be a really good thing to do. And again, I'd be really interested to see how you get on with that.
Thank you, sir. There are a few more questions, but we'll compile all the questions and send it across to you. And
yeah, okay, that's good.
Get back to them since we have to move on to the next session.
Yeah.
Thank
okay,
you,
so thanks very much, Carmelina, and thank you to the audience for some very interesting questions. And I will be really interested to hear the remaining questions. But thanks very much.